Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We have colleagues and friends joining this webinar from around the world, and you are all very welcome. My name is Jamie Scott, and it's my privilege to welcome you and to introduce my wonderful colleague, Rob Coe, who I've had the fortune to work with for many years now. And I know that Rob is always thinking hard about something, digesting vast amounts of research, evidence, and theorising about how we can best help teachers be as good as they can be in what they teach and how they teach it. And in this webinar, it's a bit of a window into Rob's current thinking. We know that improving education is not easy. Research evidence can guide us, but it doesn't provide a magic formula. And so we develop a theory of change, a kind of justification for a particular approach in delivering a specific outcome. Rob is going to set out our theory of change, our thinking about key features that enable effective professional development, exploring evidence, the trade-offs, the justifications, and the choices that we face in developing great teaching. These features are at the heart of our Great Teaching Toolkit package that we offer, but they are also features which can stand independently of our offer, and Rob's propositions will be relevant whether you use our Great Teaching resources and tools or not. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Jamie. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for those kind words. It's been great for me too to work with you all these years. Okay, so well, thanks everyone for joining this. I do think this is quite a dry title for a webinar, isn't it? A theory of change. So well done for signing up for that. I think it's a bit more interesting than perhaps the title makes it sound, because what we're trying to do here is think about this hard challenge of how we bring about at scale, so across a whole school or across a group of schools, changes that make a difference to the thing that matters most, which is children, young people's learning. And of course, this is very, very hard, and it is quite complex. And so that's why it takes such a lot of thinking about. So what I'm going to try and do now for the next bit of time is broadly two things. I'm going to talk about what do we mean by theory of change? Why does it matter? What kinds of things does it need to cover? Why is it such a big deal? Why have we spent so much time thinking about it? And then I'm going to focus in on some specific aspects of our theory of change that we've set out in 5 recent blogs. So you may have seen these on the evidence-based education website. I've written 5 blogs that are about different aspects of this overarching topic, which is really all under the heading of theory of change. So I'll say a little bit about those. Obviously, if you read the blogs, you'll get more detail, but you'll get a little bit of a taster here today. Okay, so, okay, maybe not. Theory of change, right. So what does it mean to talk about a theory of change? This is the model, the metaphor that I have in my head. It's a chain. And the idea that we do some things, so on the left, our actions, and we might be people in a school who, you know, if you're the director of professional learning or something like that, or you're responsible in some way for professional learning, these are the choices you have, the actions you can take. And at the right-hand end is what you want the outcome to be, whatever that might be. So let me just take an example then to illustrate what I mean by this. Let's think about the traditional inset session, and this is in my mind because I've done a couple of these at the start of the academic year last week, or in the last few weeks, and they're broadly speaking what I've described here as a session. A session might be a talk, it might be a workshop, it might be some other kind of format, but broadly it's an occasion where people get together, they have a common experience, perhaps they hear the same speaker, and then that's a kind of one-off, that's it. And on the right hand end is, I guess, what we hope the outcome might be, which is that our students are going to learn more. And when I do these sessions, I'm always a bit apologetic, and I say, well, you know that this won't work, that me talking to you for an hour or whatever, doing a workshop, will not lead to your students learning more. But let's think about why, how we might think that could happen. So let's fill in some of these links in the chain. Let's suppose that because of this session that you've attended and participated in, that the people who've been there know some more. And then if they know some more, that enables them to make better decisions. And if they make better decisions, that leads to changes in the behaviours that they would undertake in classrooms. And that means there would be changes in the environment of those classrooms, the culture, the values, the expectations, things that we could observe there. And that means that there are changes in the students' learning behaviours. Perhaps they become more engaged, perhaps they're more focused, perhaps they think about slightly different things, perhaps they're more motivated, or whatever that might be. And once we've got to that point, then I think it's easy to see how that can lead to them learning more. Okay, so that now starts to be a bit more plausible, perhaps. Unfortunately, I think that the first three of those, at least, are pretty implausible. In other words, they're almost certainly not true. So do we think that as a result of attending a one-off session, teachers are going to know more? That's certainly not how we think about how learning happens when we think about students. We don't just tell them something once and think, right, they've got that, we'll go away, never need to revisit that again. Do we think that if people have knowledge, that changes the decisions they make? Well, sometimes we do think that, but the evidence is against it, that mostly decision making is not informed by knowledge. There are many, many examples of people of how decision making is much more intuitive, it's much more automatic, and knowledge plays a small part. It does play a part, but it's certainly not the main factor. And then what about behaviour change? Do we think that that's going to happen? Again, lots of research about behaviour change. We know it's very, very hard to change behaviours. Even to change our own behaviours is really, really hard, let alone to change behaviours of a group of people. And fundamentally, it doesn't depend on knowledge. There are lots of things we do that we know we shouldn't do. We know what the right thing to do is. We don't do it. So I think those three are pretty implausible, actually, according to the evidence. If we do get to that point where teachers' behaviours change, then it's a bit more plausible, I think, that the classroom environments change. If the classroom environments change, then the students' learning behaviours change. And if they change in the right ways, we will have students learning more. So the others are maybe less problematic, but those three, I think, are pretty challenging. Okay, so let me just share a high-level outline of our own work on this, the theory of change that we're working with. And like everything to do with the Great Teaching Toolkit, it's a work in progress. It's a set of hypotheses. It's a provisional, here's where we're at now. It will almost certainly change, but here is where we're at now. And on the right-hand side here are the things we're trying to influence, to change, to improve. In the middle there, student academic attainment, but also students' non-academic outcomes, other character and social and so on, but also teachers' well-being and job satisfaction. These are things that are good things in their own right. They're also linked to academic attainment, so it's plausible that they may help us with that central one as well. Okay, so what do we need to do to impact on student academic attainment and these other outcomes? Well, quite a lot of stuff. These things, for example. So if I start on the left-hand end of this, we need to really focus on building teachers' knowledge and skills. Alongside that, their goals, values and beliefs. And then if we can get that right, there's a reasonable expectation that we can start to change behaviours. If we change behaviours, then we'll hopefully see some changes in the environment, and that leads to direct changes in academic attainment of students, but also changes in dispositions that lead into non-academic outcomes. So all of these things need to happen. It's a bit more complex than just a simple chain, but it is the same kind of idea. But of course, that's not enough, because what individual teachers do in terms of, or the skills and knowledge they have, is not the only thing. It matters what's going on in the rest of the school, the environment. And of course, that's determined by broadly what we call leadership, which is a little bit of a vague term that covers all these things. But school environment and leadership certainly makes a difference to things like the goals, values and beliefs. It can influence the knowledge and skills, certainly the behaviours and the environments and the student dispositions. Again, all of these things can be directly influenced by the environment in the school. And by the way, that this can also operate at lower levels. It may not be the whole school. If it's a big school like a secondary school, we might be talking about, say, a department there where the environment and leadership is a separate from the whole school, but again influenced by. So what do we need to do to influence those? Well, two sets of things. So one is what we've called teacher development cycles, which explicitly and deliberately set out to influence those three things: the teacher knowledge and skills, the teacher goals, values and beliefs, and the teacher behaviours. So we've thought about how can we change these things? How can we help teachers to develop more knowledge and skills? How can we help to influence their goals, values and beliefs? And how can we also directly change their behaviours or enable them to change behaviours in ways that they want to? We're not, the teachers are not puppets that we're manipulating. We're supporting them in making changes they want to make. So that's the development cycles. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in just a second. But then we're also supporting school leaders, or we will be, to understand how their leadership and environment is impacting on these different things and what they can do about it. So let's talk about development cycles then. This is the model for that. And again, this is quite complex. There's a lot of stuff we need to do to try and help teachers to build up what essentially we're calling expertise. And I'm going to come back to talking a bit more about that in the second half, because that was one of our blogs. Expertise is really important. It's also really complex, and there's a lot of stuff we need to do. Here's how we're thinking about this now, which is that teachers have to identify a specific desired change in their practice. So something that's going to look different in their classroom, something they're going to do differently that will have an impact on their students' learning. Now, they might choose that, just pluck it out of the air. They might choose it from a strong steer from the school leadership, for example, or they might choose it as a result of getting feedback about their current status. They might choose it as a result of studying and learning about theoretical aspects of teaching and learning. When they do choose it, they need to make a plan, and then they need to practice the thing, to hone it, to develop it, to become good at doing it, to build the skills. And in the middle there, what we've called the learning cycle bit, that central circle, it's not really a cycle because it doesn't go round, it goes back and forth. From the plan we get more feedback. If we practice, we're getting feedback as we practice, and so on. All of these things feed into each other. But crucially, we don't stop at the point where we've now built that skill and the teachers now using this change practice, or able to use this change practice with a high level of fidelity and accuracy and effectiveness, because there's another thing we have to do, which is the right hand end, which is to embed that change into routine. So we have to not just make it something they can do well, but something they can't not do well. Turn it from something that they can do when they're trying hard to do it to something that they automatically do when they're not thinking about what they need to do. It becomes a habit, in other words, a routine. And that is a non-trivial step, again, that we can't just look away and hope it happens. We have to make sure proactively, deliberately, to put in place the supports and the conditions that make that likely to happen. So there's a lot to think about here, and that's part of the point, that this is quite complicated. A lot of moving parts. Crucial to the whole of it is the choice that the teacher makes about what aspects of their practice to work on. And that's where we started from. What are the behaviours, skills, the knowledge, the goals, the belief, and so on that were in the theory of change model? Which knowledge, which behaviours, which goals, which ones make a difference? As I say, that's where we started. This was the evidence review in June 2020, and it set out this model that says these are the things that make a difference. These are, if you like, a curriculum for professional learning, the things that teachers should spend time and energy trying to get better at, because these are the things that the best research says are likely to make a difference to how much students learn. And conversely, things that are not on this list are unlikely to make a difference. So that's an important corollary as well. Okay, what sort of support? Well, there are two kinds that I'm going to mention now. One is courses. I talked about studying as being a crucial part of this development cycle. Sometimes people focus specifically on the skills. So a lot of coaching models, for example, are really focused on building skills without a lot of thinking about the underpinning theoretical principles, if you like, that determine these practices. And we think that's a mistake. We think teachers need to understand these theoretical principles. It's not always feels that exciting to do as well. Some teachers really like to do it, of course. But it's about understanding the reasons why you do a thing and how you do it and when you do it and what else you need to do with it in order to make it work. Because just being able to do it well is not enough. You have to know, is this a good time to do it? If I change it this way, will it still work? And because that's the nature of classrooms, that teachers are always adapting and responding. And if they don't have the theoretical knowledge, the understanding of the underpinning principles, then they're unlikely to be able to make good decisions about that. So that's the justification for quite a heavy focus on the theory of learning, the theory of teaching, if you like, and the sort of underpinning ideas that make these skills work, not just the skills on their own. And the other thing here is the idea of feedback, which again is a really powerful and central element of our whole thinking about supporting teachers' development. And I'm going to say a bit more about feedback because that was one of the blogs, but there's lots of different kinds. This is just one example from a student survey. And the key thing is that it's a reality check. It keeps you straight, if you like. It gives you the truth, which is not what we always get otherwise about how well things are going. Really hard to know that without good feedback. This is about the environment, and this is a review that we published a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, on school environment and leadership. What's the evidence about that? And a short summary of that review is that the evidence isn't very good, but the evidence, such as it is, supports the idea that these are the factors that make a difference to how good a teacher you can be, even with the same levels of personal expertise. So the effectiveness of teachers doesn't just depend on their expertise, it also depends on the environment they're working in and these kinds of factors about the supports that are in place, for the supports for students, supports for teachers, supports for the curriculum, the amount of time that students are spending and the overall management of the organisation. So those things all matter. Again, if you haven't seen that review, it's available online, evidence-based education, free to anyone. Okay, so let me just summarise this in a graphic then, and here are the things we need to do. So there are, broadly speaking, two things. This is the first one, building expertise of every teacher. So there are no shortcuts here. I think that's the simple message. Sometimes people try to think about how they can improve or how they think about professional development with looking for silver bullets or quick fixes. Building expertise is not that. It's slow, it's painful, it's incremental, it's hard won. Every little gain in expertise takes time, takes effort, takes energy. So it may be not that appealing. It doesn't look like it's a really attractive way to go, but it is necessary. There is no shortcut for this, we believe. You have to build expertise. So how do we do that? Well, these two things help us. One is the model for Great Teaching, which says this is the kind of expertise that we're interested in. And the other is those teacher development cycles, which are the process by which we support teachers in schools and groups and trusts or whatever to focus their time on doing things that are most conducive to building their expertise. As I say, it's not a quick win, but it is powerful. The other main thing we need to do is to think about the systems in which those teachers operate, because as I've already said, how effective you are as a teacher, how much you can help students to learn stuff, depends, yes, massively on your expertise. Expertise is really, really important. But even for the same amount of expertise, a teacher can be more or less effective if they work in a system that is conducive and helps them and supports them and removes barriers. So the systems also matter. And the kinds of things I'm talking about, these are just examples. They come from the School Environment and Leadership Evidence Review, but things like having good behaviour systems that not only work to help to regulate students' behaviour, but are also efficient. They don't take massive time and energy to make them work. The curriculum and resources that are available to teachers. And yes, I know teachers can create their own resources, but that's really inefficient and unlikely to be as good as having that done in a more coordinated, collaborative way. And that's the collaboration again around planning, assessment, those kinds of things, where they're done together, where they're done well, that can make everything more efficient and higher quality. And the last one I've listed there, constructive accountability. So the feeling within a system that what you do makes a difference, that it matters, that other people are affected by you, and that they you need to be the best you can be for their sake, that you're accountable in that sense, but constructive in the sense that you feel that it's helping you. Those systems of accountability that help you to see how well you're doing and how you could be better are helping you to be better, and they're also fair. So those are the criteria there. So those are the two big things. And then there's one more thing that underpins it, the whole thing, which is this idea of feedback. Because in order to do both those things, because schools and classrooms are so complex, it's pretty much impossible to do that unless you're in a situation where you're getting good feedback about the changes you make. Has this improved it? How well are we doing here? Where are the weak links in our chain? Where are the dark spots, the cold spots? What can we most productively focus on? Are we seeing improvement overall? All of that stuff depends on having good feedback, and good feedback is hard to get. I'll say a bit more about that in just a moment. So that's the summary. Okay. So let me move on then and just say a little bit about each of these blogs. There's the 5 blogs. They were published. They weren't published in exactly this order, I think, but this is the order that I'm going to talk about them in today. So the first one is about time for professional development. Why are we holding out for more time, even though school leaders say they can't manage it? And that was really the prompt to write this one, which is that in fact, I'd say there's a polarization here between school leaders. Some will say, when they talk about our suggestion within the Great Teaching Toolkit, is that people need to find an hour a week to work on their professional learning. I think that's way, way less than really they should find, but we've arrived at that compromise because quite often when we say an hour a week, people say, oh, there's just no way we could manage an hour a week. It's far too much. That hour a week, by the way, is split between meetings on alternate weeks and individual study and activity for an hour on the other weeks. That's a suggestion. It's not hard and fast. You might be able to find more. You might not be able to find that much. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but that's our kind of starting point. And as I say, some people say, oh no, we couldn't possibly find that amount of time. Others say, an hour a week is nowhere near enough. This is far too important for that. So there is a real divergence here across the sector, and it's really interesting. Okay, so what does the blog say about that, and what would I say about it? Well, first of all, we quote this survey from the DFE. So this is in England, teachers in England who answered a survey, and this was published just a couple of months ago, I think. On average, 50 hours a week is what they say they work. Around about half of that is their teaching time for most teachers, but squeezed in there, about an average of about 30 minutes a week or thereabouts is spent on what they would characterize as professional learning, professional development. So it's 1%, half an hour in a 50-hour week. And to me, that doesn't scream top priority. The research says that I would say professional development should be a top priority. I've called it there the gift that keeps on giving. And the reason for that is that if you invest in professional development of teachers, and in particularly enhancing expertise, you don't just get payback that year, you get payback forever for the rest of that teacher's career. For every class, every student they teach is going to benefit from that increased expertise. And that's different from things like if you buy in an intervention, if you get an intervention to support children who are falling behind, perhaps, or if you go down the route of employing teaching assistants or extra teachers to reduce class size. I know these are quite sort of farcical considerations in most schools at the moment, but the kinds of things that cost money, mostly the money's gone. They have a benefit that year, sure, yes they do, but once you then stop spending that money, that you stop the benefit. That's not true of professional development. Once you've invested, you keep it, and it keeps on going. So it's better value even than the normal comparison would suggest. But this is really hard because time is always precious. Time is always hard to find. Time is always a constraint on what we can do. And part of the problem is that it's really hard to keep our focus on things that are important because they get driven out by things that are urgent. And professional development is never going to be urgent. Nobody suffers. There's no pain if you haven't spent an hour that week on your professional learning. No one will even notice. In the long term, it will make a difference, but immediately, no difference, no detectable difference. If you haven't prepared your lessons, if you haven't done your marking, if you haven't filled in your behaviour reports or whatever, then they'll notice. So you're always going to find it harder not to prioritise those things. And you need to do those things, but we need to find ways to make sure that doesn't mean that the important stuff that's less urgent doesn't get driven out. I also quite often hear time being used as an excuse. I'm quite intolerant of this, so maybe I'm overly brutal, I don't know. But I think time should never be an excuse. If you're a school leader, your job, part of your job, is to allocate the resource that you manage, which is people, and to guide what people choose and are able to spend that time on. So you have control of that. I mean, not complete control, but you do have control. And strategy is about deciding where an organization wants to get to, deciding what resources it has at its disposal, and deploying those resources in the best way you can that aligns with those goals. And time is one of those resources, and that's one of the things that you have to manage and control. So don't tell me you haven't got time, but if you say, I haven't got time to do this, what I hear is, I've chosen to prioritize other things, and that might be fine, but it's a choice. And just finally on this to say, at no point are we saying that this hour a week or however much it is, 5 hours a week, 10 hours a week, however much you can go to, that isn't an extra thing to add on. The way you find that time is by stopping or reducing other things. And some of the things that I've talked about before, so things like collaboration and joint planning and things like that, reducing the amount of really time-intensive marking, for example. There are lots of things actually that people can do, not easy to stop doing and reduce, but in principle there are lots of things that can be done to find time to make space for this high priority, if you think it's a high priority, and you should. Okay, so that's the first one. Second one then is a real drill down into what we mean by expertise. What do we think expertise means? And we talk about knowledge, skill, and judgment. So even though other people focus on one, so that's a bit of a dig, I suppose, at people who really focus on skills a lot, or people who just focus on knowledge and don't do both, and don't also then think about how that skill and knowledge turns into expertise, which is a whole nother thing. So some of the examples that we could look at here of trying to induce change or improvement without really doing the hard work of building expertise, by perhaps just telling teachers what to do, that every lesson has to start with sharing some learning intentions, or with a retrieval quiz, or here's a marking policy, all our marking is going to be done this way. School leaders often reach for these types of policies because they certainly give an impression of doing something. They give an impression of consistency. I think very rarely do they actually bring about improvement. So they're problematic. And the reason they don't is because they ignore this whole dimension of expertise. Similarly, for implementation of complex interventions, so assessment for learning would be an example. Instructional coaching, I think, is another one. It can work. Both of those are evidence-based, good practices. But if you try and just do them without expertise, again, broadly speaking, they don't work. The expertise is the crucial ingredient that makes it work, not the thing itself. Well, the thing itself as well, but mostly it's the expertise. And this raises a whole lot of, I think, quite interesting dilemmas about, should we have a really tight prescription model where we want everybody doing the same thing, or should we have a kind of free, let 1,000 flowers bloom, anything goes model where provided it works? That might be a quite useful caveat to put in there, but as long as it works, do whatever you like. And related to that are discussions about, well, do we want everybody doing the same thing, or do we want autonomy? And of course we want both of those to some extent, maybe in different contexts. And I think that's part of the problem, that consistency prescription is probably quite appropriate for beginner teachers who have so much to learn that they just don't know where to start, and giving them some tight guidance may be very, very helpful. I'm pretty sure it's not as helpful, though, for expert teachers who are already pretty good at it. In fact, in those cases, I think it will reduce their effectiveness. So maybe it's partly about that, about being responsive to the different needs of different individuals in different situations. Anyway, this brings us on to this idea of adaptive expertise, which, as I've said already, can be characterized as an understanding of why, how, when, and with what. So it's not enough just to be able to do the thing, do a good, have the skills to manage potentially disruptive behavior, or to ask questions in a way that promotes deep thinking. You have to know why, you have to know how, you have to know when, and you have to know with what. And that's the difference between routine expertise and adaptive expertise. And the point is that classrooms are so complex. Again, there's no shortcut. You need to have that adaptive expertise. You do also need the skill. So it's not enough just to know the theory. You have to get the skill. Teaching is a practical activity, and we need to practice the skills through structured, deliberate practice type models, is the way we're going with that, that focus explicitly on skills. So we're not ignoring skills. Skills are really central. They're just not enough on their own. You need to have this adaptive expertise. So, and that at the bottom there's a quote from the blog: expertise requires a balance of knowledge, skills, and judgment. To be effective, professional development needs to address all three. So that's a question. Does the way you think about professional development really address all of those, the knowledge, the skills, and the judgment of, this is talking about classroom teachers now. And let me just say, I think that's really, really hard to do that. But that's what we're trying to do with the Great Teaching Toolkit, to support you in doing that. And I'm pretty sure it's less hard if you're using the Great Teaching Toolkit. So there's a reason to think about doing that. Okay, number 3 was about feedback, and I mentioned this a few times. Feedback is right at the heart of our thinking. So what do we know about feedback? So the first thing to say is that feedback provides a reality check. And I'm really drawn by a lot of evidence about how bad people are at making judgments, and self-evaluation in particular, in general, but certainly without good feedback. Most people, in most contexts, self-evaluation bears no relation to genuine evaluation, to reality. And in most contexts, it's much more positive. So I think it's a pretty fair bet that if you think you're doing something well, then what you should take from that is, A, I'm probably not doing it as well as I think, and B, I probably don't know much about this thing, because if I did know, I'd realise that I'm probably not doing it well. And that's not to sort of crush your feelings of competence. It's just that is the nature of these complex tasks, that that feeling of, yeah, everything's going fine is unlikely to be something that's grounded in truth, I think. So feedback gives us that reality check. I mean, it may be sometimes, but more often it isn't. In the blog, I mentioned the essay I wrote about poor proxies. That's 10 years old now. These are the things that you can see in classrooms. Children are enthusiastic, they're engaged, they're busy, they're writing, they're answering questions, they're doing all the things you'd want to see in a good classroom. These are all good things. I'm not saying you shouldn't want to see them, but you can have all those things happening and no learning. And that's one of the reasons why it's really, really hard to judge what's happening in classrooms, to judge the quality of teaching and learning by watching what's happening in classrooms. And that was another blog that I wrote, again, just under 10 years ago, about how hard it is to do lesson observation and to make sound judgments about what's actually happening. How good is this this teaching? How good is this lesson? How much learning is happening? And again, I think the message from that is that we shouldn't trust our strong intuition. If we sit in a lesson and we watch what's happening and we think, yeah, I can make a judgment about whether this is good or not. We've all done that. I've certainly done it. It's almost certainly wrong. If somebody else is in that room with you seeing exactly the same things, there's a very good chance they don't agree with you. And even if they do agree with you, there's a very good chance that you're both wrong. And that's from research. That's not just me being doom and gloom, although it might be that too. So what about feedback then in relation to professional learning? So if we're talking about assessment in relation to our students' learning, we'd say, yeah, that's essential. We have to do that. We can't help students to learn if we don't assess their learning. What about professional learning? Do we want to be assessed? Do we want to get feedback about how well we're doing? Well, maybe we don't, and traditionally we don't, but I'm saying that we should. And so we need to find ways of doing that and making that acceptable, even attractive to people. Some people really want to get that feedback. Most people are happy to get it when it's done in the right way. That's been our experience. We also draw, there's a whole literature here which is interesting. I'm not going to go into details about this thing called improvement science and what they characterize as practical measurement. It's a different approach to measurement. It's much more real time. It kind of flows in immediately. It goes to the person who's responsible for the activity, for quality, the person who can make a difference to it. So in this case, let's say a classroom teacher, they're the person who needs to get that feedback, needs to get that measurement information coming in, and it needs to be actionable so that they can understand it and know what to do with it. And we also talk about these important mechanisms. This is again, going back to the theory of change. How do we think feedback helps people? Well, it holds the upper mirror so they can see themselves, see their classrooms, see what impact they're having much more sharply. We hope it's motivating to be able to see the progress they're making and the gap closing between where they are and where they want to be. We hope it helps them to focus attention and really understand what matters. So they're focusing their attention, but also clarifying what good practice really looks like through the feedback tools. All of these things we're going to test out and find out whether those really are the mechanisms. Okay, so then number 4 is instructional coaching. This was the subject of my talk at Research Ed last week, and taking a little bit of a swipe at instructional coaching, not because it's a bad thing, but because the enthusiasm, the wave of enthusiasm seems to raise a few alarms about whether it's likely to lead to genuine improvement. So just pointed out in the blog and in my talk before, the word instruction here is confusing to a British audience, because in British English, instruction really means telling someone what to do. In the US, it doesn't mean that. It's just another word for teaching. And this language, instructional coaching, comes from the US. So that's a bit confusing. Also confusing is that the same words, instructional coaching, are used to mean quite different things in different people's language, different contexts. Many different versions of this. They're all using the same language, which is really unhelpful, and disputing about whether theirs is the one true way. And that makes it quite hard to know whether there isn't, I would say, good evaluation evidence to choose between them. So we don't really know whether one approach is better than another. This idea of the sort of wave of fashion is always a little bit of a red flag for me, because what we know about great teaching really hasn't changed. And in, let's say, the last 20 years, what did research tell us great teaching looked like 20 years ago? Is it different from what research tells us today? And I think the answer to that is no. Not that there hasn't been a lot of research since then, not that there aren't things we need to know about, not that people's awareness of that research hasn't changed. Of course, there weren't many teachers in England who knew about cognitive load theory, for example, 20 years ago, but it was around, and some people did, the work had been done, and the knowledge, the implications it has for classroom practice were already out there. They just weren't widely appreciated in classrooms, I think, as they are in many classrooms today. So whenever there's a big change like that, it's always a little bit of a worry that people are doing it not because it's suddenly become a good thing to do. It was always a good thing to do. They're doing it just because everyone else is. And then there's a point to make about going back to this question about adaptive expertise, and this being a thing that you think you can just implement in a straightforward way. And you can't. You have to have that expertise. It won't work if you don't also think about how do we build this expertise in the system. Having said that, I would say coaching, broadly speaking, is evidence-based. There's a reasonable amount of good evidence, good quality evidence, and it does find positive effects, reasonable sized positive effects. On average, there's quite a bit of variation. Not all the studies find that it works as well, and I don't think we really understand very well why it works sometimes and not others, but that's true of many things, so that's not particular to coaching. I think from research, we know that the expertise of the coach matters. We know that the intensity of the coaching practice matters. Most of those research studies talk about a day, an hour a week of actually observation, then maybe another hour of meeting between the coach and the teacher. So if you think you're going to get those effects with doing it, say, once every half term or something, well, think again, because I think you're unlikely to. And that is very expensive. These are expert coaches. The main meta-analysis cites another paper that quotes the cost as being about $5,000 per coach teacher. So if you're talking about every teacher having access to this, well, you better have quite a bit of spare cash in your professional development budget, which you may have, and you might think that it's worth it. I'm not saying it isn't, because if it genuinely improves, it could easily be worth that, but is it feasible? Is it practical? And then a final concern with this is that where are these coaches going to come from? Do we have an abundance of great teachers that we can fill those roles or backfill the teaching roles? And the answer, of course, is no, we don't. And so there's an additional cost, not just the opportunity cost of doing it, but the cost of saying, let's take all our best teachers out of the classroom and replace them with presumably less good teachers, because that's what we can get. And so children, the impact of those coaches has got to be even bigger than it would have been in order just to stand still, because to make up for the deficit of taking all the best teachers away from being in front of children. So that's a high cost, I think, and I'm unconvinced that that's going to work at scale. In fact, I don't think there's any evidence that anybody involved in this research thinks that it will work at scale. It's not being advocated as that. Okay, finally, I hope there's some questions coming in, by the way. If not, you've just got a few minutes to think of a question and get it in the Q&A, the chat. Finally, then, collaboration. This was actually the first one we published. So I start out by saying that the standard models for collaboration, things like professional learning communities, PLCs, lesson study, various other models like that, it's pretty unconvincing, I think, that these things have not been shown to systematically improve student outcomes, either because the evidence isn't great or because where they've been evaluated, they're pretty small or no effect. So that's a funny place to start if you're someone who believes in evidence, or if you are an organization called evidence-based education. Why would we start from that? Well, because I think the principles underpinning these kind of approaches are right and can be made to work. That's what we hope. That's our hypothesis anyway. So why do we think they haven't worked, and why do we think we can make them work? Well, because of three things, three requirements. So the first is the structure and focus. It's about making sure that these groups focus on the things that matter. That's like our model for great teaching, and the processes that we put in place in the development cycles to make sure that the time is best used and focuses really tightly on the things that are going to make a difference. That's one of the reasons why some of these approaches haven't worked, I think, that they didn't do that. Secondly, they sometimes don't work because in these groups there isn't enough expertise, and so they end up just recycling a whole lot of bad ideas, telling each other to do stuff, or advising, helping, supporting each other to do stuff that isn't really going to make any difference. And so they need to have a level of expertise in the group. That's one of the reasons for saying groups rather than one-to-one, because in a group of 5 or 6, there's more expertise than there is in a group of 2 people working one-to-one. But specifically, we boost that expertise explicitly by encouraging the people to study and to get feedback, and both of those things ground their thinking in what's right, if you like, and therefore build the expertise within the group. And the third thing is about challenge and support. So again, a reason why these groups can fail to produce benefit is because they just become a bit self-congratulatory, and everybody's telling each other how good they are, and they're not being really stretched to be even better, to be given ambitious goals. Ambitious goals are the best goals, but also being then supported and encouraged and it feeling positive. And again, we've thought quite hard about how we build that into the process. So we hope this will work. If it doesn't, we'll learn why it doesn't and we'll make it work. That's the process. And we can talk about this, I think, as a kind of coaching, a peer coaching, where it's reciprocal and it's group coaching. So our hope is that leverages many of the benefits of coaching that we've seen in the literature, but is much more scalable and efficient, and something that schools can do with the kinds of constraints that all schools operate under. And of course, we can't ignore that. That's really, really important. Okay, so let me wind up there. I'm just going to leave you with this summary here, which I talked about before: the need to build expertise, the need to create systems, and the need to infuse all of that with good feedback that grounds it in reality and make sure that we know whether what we're doing is working, and if it isn't, we can respond to it. And part of the intention, well, I don't know if it's deliberate, but I think the impact of what I've just been talking about is to show everyone how complex this is, all the moving parts, that to do this well, there's a whole lot of stuff that you need to think about. And the whole point is that why have we done all this thinking? Why am I saying all these things matter? Well, because we've incorporated all of these things into the structure and support that we offer through the Great Teaching Toolkit. So what I'm saying is we've kind of done that hard work for you if you use that support. And if you don't use that support, you still need to do all these things. You still need to do all that, every single element of this, but you just need to do it on your own. And sometimes people say to me, yeah, we think, we do all that and we think we do it well. And again, for me, that's a pretty sure indicator that they don't, because if they really knew what they were talking about, they would know how hard it is, and they would know that these are not things that you can easily do on your own. But do take a look at what we're offering here. I think it goes a long way towards helping people to do this really complex thing. And whether you use that or whether you use other systems, what you're doing is really important. And if there's anything that we can do to help, and many of the things I've talked about are available for free to everyone, whether you're using Great Teaching Toolkit or not. So again, I hope all that's helpful. And I'm going to wrap up there, and I'm going to hope that we have some questions or some discussion or some further comment.
We do. Thank you, Rob. I'm just scanning the questions now. So one easy one that even I can answer here, Rob. Will a recording be shared? Yes, it will. You've signed up to the webinar, and we know who you are. And so as soon as this is all processed, we'll send out an email with a link to the recording. So nice and easy one to get us started. I've also shared, by the way, in the Q&A panel, links to a couple of blogs that Rob's mentioned. So I've got a question from Tom. A nice meaty one. Rob likes a tough question. This could be tough. Is there any variation in the theory of change depending on the scope of the teacher's role? For example, looking at supporting an early years teacher versus a subject teacher in year 8 or year 12.
Okay, yeah, that is a great question. Thank you, Tom. I mean, the obvious answer is yes, of course there is, in terms of what they need to know and how they go about it and what those skills look like and the knowledge that they need and the expertise. It does all look different. I think at the level of principle, though, which is, is quite high level, what I've been talking about, that the same things apply. So the model for great teaching, I think, applies across those contexts. You might be teaching in early years, you might be teaching in advanced post 16 or whatever. The emphasis changes a bit. Some things become more important in one context than they were in another, and what they look like changes a bit. So things like how we create routines in classrooms that make transitions efficient, for example, that's very different in a reception classroom than it is in, say, A-level physics or something like that. So yes, of course they look very different, but the principle is the same, that every second of every lesson really matters, and we need to think about how we make sure that the time is maximized, that students are using that time to think productively about the ideas we want them to learn. So I think when we talk at the level of principle, it is much the same. How do teachers learn to be better? Again, I think it's pretty much the same. But the reality of it does vary definitely by the systems and the context they're in. So the school environment makes a difference to that for sure. But I've said that, and that's one of the things that we need to focus on and optimize. So I don't know if that's an answer. It's a little bit of a dodge, but I think the answer is at the level of principle, yes, it's the same. But when you get down to the detail, it's very different.
Okay. And here's one for you. My school conflates growth with an evaluation/appraisal process. I feel the two should be separated. What does the evidence say about this?
Okay, so growth as in professional development growth.
I assume so, Bob.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so I mean, the evidence on this I think is a bit mixed, and it is a bit this can be a bit of a hard one to swallow. So the evidence about accountability, for example, which many teachers really hate and certainly can do a lot of bad stuff, and there are definitely bad kinds of accountability, but overall I would say accountability, when it's been evaluated, has some modest positive effects. It's not negative in terms of things like students learning. I think, and that's why I always use this word constructive in front of it. Other people talk about intelligent accountability, for example, and I think we're all in the same space a bit. But by constructive, I mean two things. One is that the perception of the person, yes, I feel accountable, I feel held to account, but the systems around me that hold me to account feel as though they're supporting and helping me to grow. So whether appraisal or performance management should be linked to professional learning, I think is less important than how it feels to the person who's receiving it, if you like. So if that appraisal and performance management process feels like it's helping you to grow, then it's a good thing. If it doesn't feel like it's helping you to grow, then it probably isn't. So it has to be managed in that way. And the second criterion is that it has to be perceived as fair. So if a judgment is made, if somebody comes into your lesson and observes and says, well, that there's lots of areas for development here, and you think that's wrong, then that accountability also doesn't help you, doesn't lead to improvement. So those would be my criteria to put on it, but it is quite complex. It's certainly not the case that you should just completely separate out all these processes so that there's no kind of scrutiny of people's practice, no scrutiny of their impact, no scrutiny of how well they're doing this really, really important job. That does need to be something that's out there, not just a personal private thing for them. It needs to be part of an accountability process, I think, but it needs to be seen as supportive and it needs to be seen as fair.
Okay, I'm going to get a bit Jeremy Paxman on you because we have quite a few
2 minutes.
questions.
Okay, I'll try and be quick.
Yeah, people are welcome to stay around for questions or leave now, obviously. So what's your top tip, Rob, for avoiding or minimizing the risk of lethal mutations?
Okay, well, yeah, lethal mutations are really interesting, aren't they? And we've written, I know Kate's written a blog about that on our website as well. I think expertise is the inoculation that we're looking for here, because the thing about lethal mutations is that they're misunderstandings of that people take an idea and they have a misconception about what it is, or they don't have the skill to actually do it, or they're not aware of how it's going wrong. All of these things happen, and all of them are essentially covered by what I would describe as expertise. It's the skills, the knowledge, and the judgment. And that's part of the reason why lethal mutations are so prevalent, aren't they? They're all over the place. So I think by doing this hard, painful, slow work of building expertise, that's how we avoid these sort of fashion jumping on things, doing the superficial version of it and turning it into something that it isn't, which I would broadly characterize as a lethal mutation.
Okay, what are your views on whole school CPD sessions that are led by your own staff? Do you see value in everyone getting the same messages, but then working in their own teams for action planning and implementation?
Okay, so who leads it, I don't think really matters, as long as they have the expertise to do it. And of course, many colleagues in the same school will have that. I do think that there's value in consistency, people hearing a common message, people using a common language, people having a common experience, particularly if that experience is motivating and helps them to and energizing. All of that's good. I just think it's not enough on its own if that's all you do, or if that's the main thing you do, because when you think about building expertise, it's slow, it's painful, it's incremental, it's got to happen every week. It's not something you can just do at the start of term or occasionally. So by all means do those sessions. And you know, I do them. I said I've done a couple this year. I don't say no, this is a waste of time, I'm not going to do it. I say yes, I'm happy to do it, but you do know that this has to be part of something else, and it's really the something else that's going to make the most difference, not the session.
So what comes next?
Yes.
Rob, what's your top tip for? No, sorry, that's the question I've read before. Is there any evidence about whether the coach has to be an expert in coaching or an expert in teaching, or both? Great question.
Yeah, really good question. Thank you. There is a bit of evidence. It's not great. I don't think it really gives us a strong conceptual clarity about what we mean by. I think we know that the expertise of the coach matters. I think that is one of the reasons why it sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't. What does that expertise consist of? I think it's quite likely that yes, there are these two elements. One is the sort of domain knowledge of the thing that you're trying to help the teacher to be better at. So you have to know how to do that yourself. You have to be a great teacher, if you like, a practitioner, but also someone who understands it. So some teachers are just sort of naturally brilliant and they can't really articulate why they're great. So I think you have to have that as well. But you also have to be able to manage the relationship, and some versions of coaching really the relationship is you know, right at the center of how they see that operating. It's almost like a counseling relationship in some versions of this, and so the skills of personal interaction become very, very important in those models. I think they're probably important in all models. So yeah, I think it's a quite a sort of big basket of skills actually.
Okay. Our school is currently doing a whole school inquiry and we have set up peer support networks. However, our hands are tied a lot with a lack of time dedicated to this. What would you say the best bets are to run this successfully with very limited time allocated to it?
Well, time, as I've said, is an indicator, is an indicator of the priority that people give to something. So if time hasn't been allocated to it, what the people who've set this up are saying is we don't really think this is very important. So that's, I mean, that's a bit brutal, but I think that's got to be there. It depends what you mean by inquiry. I'm always a little bit concerned when I hear that, because I don't think it's a bit like inquiry as a pedagogical approach. You know, we want students to understand this hard idea. We're going to set them off to discover it for themselves. I just don't think that's a very efficient way of learning in general. And so it can quite easily go down different routes that are not very productive. It's hard to structure it in a way that keeps it focused on the most valuable activity. Not to say that everything has to be completely directive and prescriptive and structured. I think there's a balance to be had, but I think inquiry per se, and maybe that isn't what's being talked about here, it can be a lot of time spent doing things that actually don't lead to genuinely building expertise. That's the key thing. So I mean, that's a complex question. It's hard to give a good answer without knowing more about it, because I may have misunderstood what's going on. But I think that there was a part of the question was about the time allocation. Can you do this in not much time? Well, you can try to be efficient with a small amount of time. It's just really hard. You are going to achieve less if you have less time. I think that's the reality. And that's why you need to use that time as effectively as possible. And I suppose I might question whether inquiry is the best way to do that in terms of what we know about the evidence about what expertise is and how it's developed.
Yeah, it depends how you're applying inquiry, doesn't it? Because I talk about the Great Teaching Toolkit and the use of student surveys and feedback as part of inquiry and reflection that is
indeed
focused and clear.
Yeah.
So yes, we'd need to know a bit more about that. So Bernie Cassidy says, Rob, we're in our third year of implementing the Great Teaching Toolkit using a combination of professional development strategies. What it highlights is the challenge to help teachers thrive. There is a huge gap between teacher training and the aspiration that we have. For primary school staff, the demands for good subject knowledge compound this. So 13 subjects.
Yeah.
What good practice are evidence-based education encountering to help with this?
Okay, well, what you're saying is, Bernie, I mean, you've 3 years that you're an early adopter, you've been with us a long time, that's great to hear. What you're saying is this is bloody hard, and you're right, it is bloody hard. It's the hardest. Teaching is the hardest job in the world, and learning to be a better teacher is even harder. So yes, and it's complex, and you're right, 13 different subjects, the subject knowledge required is colossal. I think the thing is not to be overfaced by the everything we can't do or everything that could be better, but just to start with one thing. Pick one thing that you can productively spend time getting better at and focus on that one thing and get better at that one thing. And yes, you might be overwhelmed by, well, what about all the other million things that I'm not going to focus on? Well, there will come in time. There is a kind of acceleration to this process. I think as you start to get traction, you start to get better at one thing, then the next thing becomes a bit easier. And after that, the next thing, and it draws in other things as well. So that over time, it starts out feeling really, really hard. And as you get momentum going, I think it starts to drive itself a little bit and to kind of draw stuff into it. But yeah, it is really, really challenging. But it is not only the hardest thing in the world, it's the most important thing in the world, that you are the only chance those children get, or the best chance that they get. And what you do every day makes a difference to their lives. Their whole lives are affected by everything that you do. So if that helps you to keep that focus and keep working on it, then well, I hope it does. It is really, really important.
I think maybe there's something to say about feedback there. We've got a really interesting case study on our website that shows a teacher in a school using the student pupil surveys and the feedback that we provide there. When they did focus on one thing, it was in the area of metacognition and self-regulated learning, which is dimension 4, element 6 of the model for great teaching. And they saw that the student perceptions in how the teacher supported independent learning was quite low, and then they did something about that, and they did 2 follow-up surveys and got feedback to show that the student perceptions had changed. Therefore, that can be quite motivating, can't it, to the process? And feedback can be motivating to see, just like students, if they see signs of success and change, then that motivates them further.
Yeah. And that's a great case study, and it's absolutely right. There's nothing more motivating than feeling that you're improving something.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we don't necessarily know or need to improve what is perceived to be the weakest area. There could be more leverage in getting even better at something that you're already quite good at.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to throw one question out there. So Vicky says it's been stated that the most important thing teachers need to know is cognitive load theory.
Okay.
Thoughts? Was it Dylan William that said that?
I think Dylan has said that, yeah, that this is
Oh,
the most important thing teachers
yeah.
need to know. I mean, is it the most important thing? I think it's useful to know. Cognitive load theory does have implications for teachers, for sure. I think it can change the way you think about the whole learning process. People talk about the science of learning as if that makes it quite sort of grand. In fact, we have a course called the Science of Learning. So but deep down, you know, core ideas about limited working memory processing capacity in people's heads, that we have to be careful not to overload that, but long-term memory is pretty much infinite. And, you know, there's a whole lot of stuff that I do think does have implications for teachers. But if you read a whole lot of books about cognitive load theory, let's say, and there are some great books out there, will that make you a better teacher? No, because you have to do all these other things that are in the development cycle process of practicing practicing deliberate practice of those specific techniques that you're going to improve, getting feedback so that you can actually ensure that you are getting better at them, understanding the principles behind it, which yes, you might get that from reading. So cognitive load theory, it's a good theory, it's important. Is it the single most important thing? I mean, there'd be a lot of contenders for that claim. I'm not really sure whether it is or not. It's hard to say. There isn't just one thing that's going to transform you into a much better teacher.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that note, Rob, and also because the football team I coach has a game kicking off at 6 o'clock, I'm going to draw it to a close there.
You better run.
I think we've covered off all the questions, not just for selfish reasons. So thank you very much, Rob. Thank you to everybody who joined us. Thank you to everybody who's watching this back in the recording. We hope to share the recording probably tomorrow if all goes well, but certainly if not tomorrow, then it'll be early next week. So thanks again for joining us, and I hope you found it useful.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck.
Take care.